Good morning, everyone. My name is Luis Manuel Espinosa, and I work in the knowledge department at the IDB. We're waiting just a few seconds. We have a lot of people attending this meeting. They're connecting right now. We are at about 400 attendees. We'll wait a few more seconds so everyone can hear the introductory remarks. We're going to share some housekeeping and then go into the session. So good morning to everyone, and we'll begin in a few moments. Good morning once again. Welcome all. Welcome to this second virtual meeting on food security. This is our second edition on this topic, and today we're going to talk about the future of agri-food systems and rural transformation. Just a few housekeeping items before we start. There is interpretation. You can see that at the bar at the bottom. In terms of questions for our panelists, we'd like to ask you all to share those through the chat. And of course, we ask that you keep your mics muted. That will help us better hear the moderator and the panelists who will be able to access their own microphones. Without further ado, let me thank you all once again for being with us today. I would now like to offer the floor to Juan Pablo Bonilla, who is the manager for climate change and sustainable development at the Inter-American Development Bank. Juan Pablo, the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you, Luis Manuel. Allow me to also wish everyone good morning and particularly welcome our panelists to today's session, Carolina, Julio, and Juan Lucas, and to all of those joining us for this event. As Luis Manuel was saying, this is the second webinar we're holding on this topic. The first one was focused on the impact of COVID in food security throughout the region and in other regions throughout the world. And that day, I talked about how the IDB has had a few liquidity pilots to help countries throughout these months, and not only to strengthen health systems and unconditional transfers for the poor, and also support for micro enterprises, which is key, and also to have more liquidity in finance ministries for quick responses. The question that many of us are asking is, during the transition, because we are going to have to live with COVID for quite some time, so going forward, what does recovery look like? One of the issues, or many of the issues that COVID has made us think about, is how we look at work going forward. And so one of the things to think about is rural transformation. I have talked about this with a few of you, and some of these things have been around for years, not only for rural areas, but also urban areas, and those increasingly clear links between cities and rural development. As a matter of fact, many cities have within their city limits, and sometimes their definition of a city, rural areas. And so we need to think about rural development that is more linked with urban development, and we need to focus on food security. And so how can we have more inclusive rural development that is more inclusive, and how can we work more closely with cities? And from the national government, what can we do to move this forward? We have three illustrious panelists who are with us to talk about these issues. Once again, I thank them very much for being with us today, and we're going to offer the floor now to Pedro Martel, who is our Division Chief for Rural Development and the Environment, who is going to moderate this panel. Thank you very much, Juan Pablo, and thank you all very much for joining us for this webinar. We're happy to have you here. And this event should last about 1.5 hours. We'll have remarks and presentations from the three panelists, and then we'll have 30 minutes for Q&A. Before we begin, I would like to share some information about our panelists. We have first Carolina Trivelli, who is a senior researcher at the Institute of Peruvian Studies. She is a specialist on poverty, social policies, and rural development, and she was Minister of Development and Social Inclusion in Peru. And today she's going to talk to us about the drivers of change and which opportunities are before us to create a new rurality, which is what we need to strengthen more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient systems that Juan Pablo was talking about. Then we'll hear from Juan Lucas Restrepo, who is the director of the Partnership of Biodiversity International and SIAT. Juan Lucas has been working for over 25 years on agriculture, and among other positions, he was Deputy Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development in Colombia. He was the Executive Director of Corpoica, and he also led the transition towards Arasavia, which is the largest agricultural research organization in Colombia. He is going to talk to us about what role technology plays to boost and leverage that rural transformation. Then we will hear from Julio Verdeguer, who is the regional representative for Latin America and the Caribbean at FAO, and he is going to talk to us about the changes necessary at the institutional level to support that transformation. Julio has been working on these issues for years and now, and I know Julio is someone I've known for about 20 years, and for as long as I've known him, he's been working on issues related to these. There will be 12 minutes for each presentation, and following presentations, we are going to have 30 minutes, as I said earlier, for Q&A with attendees, and we ask you all to please use the chat. We're going to use that feature so that we can have a smooth conversation, and so without further ado, I would like to now offer the floor to Carolina, who is going to be our first presenter today. Thanks again, Carolina. Thank you, Pedro, and thank you to all my colleagues at the ADB. Thank you for inviting me. Let me share my screen. Very good. Well, I know that I only have a few minutes, so let me get right into it. Now, this presentation is one that we talked about, and the idea was to talk about the current situation and what the drivers of change are for boosting and spurring this transformation in rural areas. The idea is to rekindle the discussion on rural areas, the rural sector, and the region. The first issue to highlight is that the rural sector matters. It's important for the region for many reasons. And this is not only because this is where we grow food, which of course is very important at this time, which has been made abundantly clear. And this is something we'll get into a little bit later. But the rural sector is also important for other reasons. First of all, if we really want to move forward with SDGs, many of the monitoring and follow-up indicators for SDGs depend on what happens in the rural sector, and some of them depend exclusively on the rural sector and changes that need to happen. Secondly, there are sectors of the population, and usually in the region, they get overlooked because we look at urban. And so this is a population that is decreasing when we look at absolute numbers in a few countries. But what's important to note here is that when we look at the functional capacity of different sectors in Latin America, what we find is that there are national official numbers that show that about 19% of the LAC region population lives in rural areas. But when we look at what kind of work is done in these areas, and what we see when we look at medium-sized cities and other townships, almost 40% of the population in Latin America and the Caribbean can be considered to be rural populations. And so those numbers, I think, highlight a greater reality than the official numbers. a large part of a lot of our countries continues to be rural, and in Latin America, for example, rural populations have a lot of either indigenous populations or black populations that make up the larger numbers. But above and beyond that, rurality in Latin America and the Caribbean and these rural sectors are vital for environmental sustainability. That goes for the region, of course, but also for the entire planet. The region only holds 16% of global land mass, but it has 40% of the world's biodiversity. Now, to get to the key part of today's topic, let's talk about food, which is key, particularly when we talk about healthy diets. Latin America and the Caribbean play a key role in the region because that is where more food is grown than is consumed in the region. And so the food being grown can feed the entire region, but which is even more important, it can also feed people outside of our region. We also have a great commodity diversity, and all of that makes what is being grown in rural areas even more important. That is important for food, for each of the countries, and for rural areas and urban areas in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also beyond. Now, another key issue here is that we usually talk about the rural sector as it's linked to agricultural activity and growing crops. But in Latin America and the Caribbean, the rural sector, of course, is a key player in production and exports and employment, but it also is home to other parts of our economy, which are growing and are going to be increasingly important assets for the growth we'll see over the next few years. We're talking about environmental industries, environmental services, and producing other services. Unfortunately, tourism is one of the key areas, but one that has been dealt one of the biggest shocks in its history, but also conventional industries like hydrocarbons and other extractive industries. Those are in rural areas in our region. And so when we look at the rural sector and we look at what parts of the economy are found in this region, then we see that there's a lot of diversity. And there are a lot of different economic activities that go far and beyond just farming. And so the key point here is that we need to understand that there are all of these different sources and ways of looking at the rural sector. And this brings us to the main point here, which is that rural matters. It's important for each of the countries, it's important for the region, and it matters for the world because our planet needs a better functioning rural sector. Now, the rural sector is also faced with great opportunities and changes and shifts coming from different drivers of change and drivers for transformation that not only affect the rural areas, but also have a direct impact on the economy and which could be used to carry forward more prosperity and transformation focused activities. And so these characteristics are the ones that need to be achieved for the transformation. And to achieve all of this, these drivers of change must be seen as opportunities. These drivers of change, and this is all part of a document that we put together in the 2030 series when we were talking about food and agricultural developments under the FAO. We talked about three key drivers of change that could really speed up this transformation. And the first has to do with climate change and global warming. And this is because that is going to have an impact on production in the rural sector. It's going to have a big impact. It's an impact we've already started to see. And currently, and going forward as well, the region is going to see temperatures rising, which are going to change production capacity as well as different supply chains within the rural sector. The second driver of change that we found and we highlighted in the document that Julian and I worked on has to do with the change in soil. This new look on the need for healthier food, for more sustainable nutrition, how to have a healthier diet, lower degrees of excess weight and obesity, and look at changes in the urban consumption model, but also look at more sustainable ways to farm and to grow crops in Latin America, especially when we look at the high emissions of CO2s, which forces us to look at the livestock sector as well as other agricultural activities to identify changes. And so addressing these environmental issues is going to impact the way that we have been doing work in this sector, and we need to make the most of this opportunity so that we can spur this transformation. Now, the third driver of change has to do with these different kinds of technology innovation: digitalization, mechanization, artificial intelligence, agro precision communications. There are a great deal of opportunities, and all of these can help us improve our production capacity and systems and enhance our agri-food systems. These are great opportunities, but the challenges are also fairly big. Adopting these different technologies could perhaps widen the gap between the most modern and those left behind. We know that this could exacerbate the situation that many of our local producers are already facing. And so, what we need to take into account is that the solution to all of our problems will not be technology alone, but it does provide opportunities to continue to close that divide. Now, a driver of change that we cannot get around is COVID-19 and these extended and protracted lockdowns, which is having an impact on our rural environments as well. Now, of course, staying on lockdown has an impact on our health, and there are all sectors have felt the consequences of this. Perhaps the agricultural sector a little less than others, but COVID-19 is going to continue to exacerbate poverty, and all of this is going to set us back. And that is something that holds true not only for the rural sector, but also other sectors. Now, there are opportunities as well that stem from COVID-19. And that is because now more than ever, we're perhaps before one of these rare opportunities. This is because the urban areas have started to realize how important rural areas are and have been thankful for the food produced in rural areas in the context of this crisis. And so that needs to be seized. Now, just in closing, I wanted to mention that the idea of rural transformation should be made up of these three pillars, all happening at the same time: social inclusion, transforming the rural economy for greater prosperity, and a new relationship established for the use and consumption of natural resources. And these drivers of change need to also take into account the implications of COVID, because this is how we can seize the opportunities coming from these drivers of change, although there are also risks. And what we need to understand is that these drivers of change are there, whether we like it or not. And so the best thing to do is see how to use them to our advantage so that we can have rural transformation based on these three pillars, all under a new institutional framework for rural transformation. And just to close by saying that inclusive and prosper and sustainable rural transformation, of course, will lead to rural development throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. But that is also going to have an important and positive impact on development and prosperity in urban areas in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as their economies. It is also going to enhance sustainability and the overall health of the planet. And so, rural transformation based on these three pillars, drawing on these different drivers of change, are all going to have a positive impact and make a difference in Latin America and the Caribbean as a region, and therefore in the world. So, we need to take a serious look at how we can best spur this transformation. All of these ideas are found in this document, and you can go to the FAO website at this web address at the bottom to look at the details at your leisure. Thank you very much.
Carolina. Y
Thank you very
bueno,
much,
pues,
Carolina.
bueno, primero gracias a todos los participantes porque veo que el
Let
chat
me also
está
thank all
bastante
attendees because I'm
activo.
seeing a lot of activity on the chat, some
Preguntas
questions already coming in. And one of the questions was whether they would have access to the
ya
document.
se
And
compartió
so
también en el chat, pero también
that
gracias por ponerlo.
URL was also shared through the chat, but thank you for also sharing it in your presentation.
Carolina, un tema
Now,
antes
Carolina,
de pasar a
before
Juan
we
Lucas, un tema
move
que,
on to
bueno,
Juan Lucas,
precisamente el libro o el documento que
there's
preparó
an issue that has to do with
es
the document that you put
una
together that
forma
I
de
wanted to talk
resolver
about. Now, I
unos,
remember,
no sabría cómo decirles, una
and I'm trying to
tensión
find the right words, there was a
claro,
sort of a tension,
cuando
or
se hacen políticas para lo rural,
when there
dice
are
casi
rural
textualmente, en el peor de los
policies,
casos,
and you said in your
se habla de
paper that
agricultura
in
familiar,
the
pero se
best case
olvida
scenario, we talk about family farms,
específicamente
but
para agricultores pobres.
usually these are poor
Y entonces me
policies that
recuerdo
are
cuando leí el documento
formulated
que
for
decía
poor farmers.
exactamente
And when I
bastante
read that in the
textual,
document, I was
entonces el día
trying
de
to
hoy
think,
podemos compartir con
what does
la
this
audiencia qué
mean?
quiere
And I
decir
try to
esto, a qué se
dig deeper, but
refiere.
I'm wondering if you can talk to our
¿Cuál fue el
attendees
sentido
and
de la
guests about
estrategia
this. What does this
para
mean? And what
resolver
are the
los
consequences of
problemas
these policies? Once
para
again,
agricultores
poor
pobres?
policies
Entonces,
for
si podemos
poor
elaborar un poco sobre
farmers.
esto.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Yes, there's a major challenge when we think about policies for true rural transformation and the development of the agri-food sector, and to rethink the idea of effective policies for rural development. And that is that we need to look at the rural sector as a whole and understand that it is as expensive as it is. And so when we look at the bulk of the policies that have been implemented over the last few years, perhaps I'll go back as far back as 10 years in the region, they have focused on rural development or perhaps family farming development. Those policies have been very targeted, but very specific to solve a very small problem that's affecting a small group of farmers. And so we have failed to put together an overall comprehensive policy that is larger in scope that can actually look at the rural development ability for the entire region that can help our countries, our societies, and the region, something that actually helps the planet. And so usually we'll have these small scale policies for example, enhancing productivity in one sector to help one family farm. And so there's no way to really have a systemic impact through this because those aren't accompanied by social policies or infrastructure enhancement policies or anything on environmental sustainability, which is the set of instruments needed to face the challenges that rural communities are encumbered with. And that is a way to include more people and to do better and to do more. And so I think we need to get away from these specific and very detailed, isolated policies so that we can understand that rural development should be seen as a whole with a larger scope. And also understand that a better developed rural sector can have a real impact in the region and in each of the countries.
Gracias, Carolina. Digamos, es un
Thank you,
abrebote para
Carolina.
lo que se viene en la
That's a
sesión,
great
porque
taste for what's
el
coming next.
posicionamiento que has hecho ahora
in our series because you have just explained what the challenge is. We, on other occasions, have talked about fiscal policies that should accompany these kinds of steps and also make sure that we're creating a virtuous cycle so that we can do more with fewer resources and achieve this role transformation. And so that's a major issue. So thank you very much for putting that on the table. Now, we're going to hear from Juan Lucas Restrepo, who is going to talk about one of those drivers of change that Carolina was talking about, and that is technology development, and who is going to talk to us about where things currently stand. Thank you very much, Juan Lucas. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pedro. I'm going to be sharing my screen. I will set that up to get started. And I hope you can see this. I guess you can. So first of all, I want to thank the IDB for holding this webinar. I am very pleased to see that there are hundreds of people interested in this major issue, the future of agri-food systems in the region, especially in such a complicated time. I wanted to thank you too, Pedro. I may be the only panelist who is actually on the other side of the pond. I'm on the other side of the Atlantic. I join you from Rome. And here I'm going to be talking about an important partnership between two institutions, Biodiversity International and CIAT. CIAT has had a great track record. It has had a great impact in the agriculture and food sector of the Americas. So I greet you from over here. You can see my backdrop. These are tomatoes that I'm growing at home. So you can see that I'm getting my hands dirty once in a while. Now, basically, what I wanted to address, the topic I was assigned, is technology. And as Carolina was saying very rightly, we have a major challenge, and that is that food production has always been and continues to be the major determining factor of environmental degradation and loss of biodiversity. And it's the agri-food system that has to give rise to at least a lot of the solution. Now, these are terrifying figures. You're acquainted with them, so I am not going to go into any depth. But in terms of water consumption, deforestation, the accelerated loss worldwide and in the Americas, we're losing our natural forests and everything that has to do with greenhouse gas emissions. Here you can see that this is being followed by our societies. Often agriculture is blamed for the major degradation we have witnessed. Also, we see the matter of climate change. It's not only a risk for agriculture, but for society as a whole. And we can see that the most negative scenarios, but the scenarios that are within the ranges of what is possible, you can talk about an increase in food prices of up to 84% by 2050. And the cruel reality is that change and climatic variability affect especially small-scale farmers, those who have no irrigation, those who use very little technology, and especially those that are located in the tropics. And it is in the tropics where a lot of Latin America's production takes place. Now, this also has to do with both the diagnosis of the disease and its cure. As Carolina was saying, the situation is dramatic. Throughout the history of mankind, we have used different animals and plants as part of our diet. And right now, we're only using some 200 sources. And of those 200, 9 plants and animals represent 70% of the production. And 3 crops produce rice, wheat, and corn. which provide more than 50% of the calories of vegetable origin worldwide. Now, what does that mean? That means that we have been standardizing what producers receive, and that means that we have a homogeneous distribution of foodstuffs. This affects those involved in value chains, and those are affected by equity issues. Now, that diet, which is more homogeneous, is causing about 11 million premature deaths per year. And those are deaths that are related with an unhealthy diet. These are deaths that basically come from 2 billion people that are overweight or that have what we call hidden hunger. And to this, we add the 820 million people who are actually going hungry. And to this, we add 42.5 million who live in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is precisely caused by the pandemic. Now, basically, why is it that we are in this situation? Why has humankind created a model that wound up creating such a negative effect on the environment and society? This is what I call the unforeseen effect of our race for calories. In the early 60s, when the major challenge was fighting hunger, all agriculture systems, research, financing, standards, institutional systems focused on producing calories in abundance and at a lower cost, so as to support a growing population that was poor in urban areas, also rural areas too, for that matter. And because of that, our agricultural landscape is currently made up of very little diversity in terms of the value chain. And that also opens up new economic and social opportunities in the agri-food sector. Now, COVID-19 can either support that trend, or it could also be an opportunity to create a turning point. And in the dialogue with agencies like the IDB, dialogues between organizations, ministries of agriculture, etc., I think that the solution may come from those dialogues. I don't think that the world is going to change its diet substantially in the near future, but we do have to open up cracks so as to make the diet more diverse, and that will create landscapes, value chains, short circuits that will bring new opportunities. So without being excessively optimistic, I think that there is an opportunity to reach an inflection point, and that is going to mean changes in institutional frameworks and normative requirements, the production of seeds, etc., everything requiring flexibility that requires an agricultural sector that is more tuned to the environment. Now, for this purpose, we have to understand that when we talk about agriculture, we're not talking just about agriculture, thinking about institutions, agricultural policies, without also thinking about nutrition and health, because all of these things are clearly interconnected and they're connected to the environment. A Ministry of Agriculture that doesn't work with the Minister of the Environment, the Ministry of Health, because of that intersection amongst the three circles, will produce incomplete policies or policies with negative externalities. So examples of what we're seeing: crops, genetic improvement, the way that plants are grown. This has to change. It's not only a matter of focusing on higher production, dealing with pests or diseases. That's been the focus of genetic development over the last few decades. But we have to look at plants that tolerate greater temperature fluctuations. They have to contribute more to diets. And also we have to do genetic improvements to promote health. How can we, for example, help out with the non-communicable diseases, things like diabetes, cardiac disease. All of that is closely related to diet. So how can we make certain that the food on our plates helps address health issues? And in our partnership, we have been able, for example, to identify a beautiful bean. It is a bean that we have been able to combine with the currently used beans, but we have seeds that can tolerate 4 degrees centigrade more in temperature. So that's what we have to be thinking about. And this is something that we saw in Carolina's talk too. That interaction with the climate has to be included in all government policies and in the cooperation throughout the hemisphere. And that means that we need to support decision-making by providing data. And that has to go not only to policy makers, but also to the farmers. There are good examples, for example, out of Nicaragua and other countries too, and they are focusing more and more on agricultural technologies and practices that allow farmers to adapt as they cultivate their crops. And of course, all of the communication models that Carolina was talking about, all of the climate information, early warnings, all of that helps manage risk. And that has to be a central factor in all food issues. Also, we have to look at the value chains, and here you can see examples. Cacao, coffee are very important value chains, and they are under threat because of climate change in the region. And we see that if we can redesign production systems, if we begin to understand how we can increase tree diversity, how can we come up with trees that have not only an ecological function, but an economic function too? How can we bring in some underused species, make them part of the productive system, and that can provide not only better research, but also can improve the quality and the production of the final product. Now, regarding digital inclusion, when I say inclusion, that's an important word because if we do nothing, we will continue to run the risk of the poorest, those who have not been able to gain access to things digital, will be left out of this major revolution. So a digital revolution means closing those gaps and making good use of the potential of new technologies for things like what we are showing here on this slide. How can we make sure that the way we do research, developing new seeds, new managerial practices, how can we put that not just in the hands of a couple of researchers, but in the hands of thousands of producers? So with access to technology, using a cell phone or with text messages, they can contribute to massive research. They participate as citizens. So this is a great opportunity to be more efficient, not only in terms of the results, the speed of research, but also making certain that the results of the research are implemented by these farmers and their communities. Also, we see that artificial intelligence has an important role to play. For example, in the first generation, it can help with the diagnosis, with crop surveillance. We have a tremendous risk in the region, Fusarium R4, that can put an end to a monocrop, a single crop that is grown throughout the region. So how can we accelerate using artificial intelligence the diagnosis so that we can contain that disease while we come up with more structural solutions? Or, for example, we are seeing in our research where we have to go and analyze 10,000 different plants, different lines of production to identify the white leaf virus of rice. So we can do that with a drone and with AI in a matter of seconds. So all of these are opportunities that can be extended to a larger scale. Now, Also, we have to see how we can replenish agricultural landscapes so as to better serve our populations. Here, the private sector comes in, and here you can see how we can revamp the incentives and the way that policies are related to producers. We have a wonderful case. The idea was in the Amazon, in Brazil, we could come up with economic models with private investment promoting the sustainability of natural resources so as to stop the tremendous deforestation we're witnessing. Now, that would mean projects that are agroforestry and also grazing, something that was seen in the past as something that was quite basic, but actually this requires the knowledge brought by science. Now we see that farmers now understand that there are agro-environmental principles that have to be upheld. Now, another wonderful example that we have of how we could make sure that we have greater diversity in the food on our plates, here's a great example of how in Brazil, with a lot of actors, but also with the leadership of Embrapa, we were able to look at the nutritional contribution of 20 different species of vegetables, leafy vegetables. 6 of them are native. We don't have to obsess over native plants, but of course that is an important consideration. And now there are political or policy determinations that have been made giving priority to 100 species. This has a possibility of creating value chains, and in that way, for example, school meals can give priority to these new species that need to change the homogeneous landscapes that I was referring to. Then lastly, we see that there are ways for this to not just be a subjective matter, not just something that we like to talk about. We have to understand how right now we can measure in terms of sustainable production, policies, value chains. We can look at how countries are acting. We can look at if they are conserving or promoting their agro-biodiversity and how over time, they incorporate this into their policymaking. Here you can see that we have the Agro-Biodiversity Index for Peru. This is something that would lead us to rethink the way that we develop statistics for agricultural sectors. So this becomes more complex, but it's more in keeping with the agri-food analysis that we currently make. So that is my contribution, Pedro. Thank you very much. Thank you, Juan Lucas. Once again, I wanted to thank all of the participants for all of the activity on the chat. Several people are asking about sharing the presentations. And yes, they will be on the bank's webpage, but also we can send them to you via email and also give you a link if you want to go back to re-listen to a specific part of this event. Juan Lucas, there's something that we have talked about. Actually, before we went live, we were talking about this. You talked about the intersection between food production, nutrition, and also the environment. And of course, this is part of the current research paradigm. Now that we have gone from being a research institution, and now that you have this partnership between CIET and biodiversity, what could you say about the national research institutions in the region? Are they prepared to tackle this challenge, or what difficulties would they have if they measure up to it? Could you share some thoughts in that regard? Of course, Pedro, as we were saying before we started the program, it's very important to see how much society relies on the findings of natural research institutions. Right now, the incentives for politicians, for ministers, have always been more focused on short-term subsidies, investing in institutions that have the capability of actually producing more valuable solutions in the short term. And what we were able to do in Colombia, and that came at a very good time, was that we can think of these institutions, thinking of completely renewing them, revamping them. We were talking about governance, bringing in new people with PhDs, not necessarily from the host country, but opening up space, trusting these institutions. Of course, requiring them to have governance, to respect ecosystems, to have clear linkages with agricultural production so that they can be held accountable for the way that they're using resources. But yes, there is space to do this. Now, the experience in Colombia was an interesting one, and without those anchors in each country of a small, medium, or large research institution, they need to be connected, because without them, it will be very difficult for countries to change their agri-food systems, or they will do so too late, and they will be at the end of the line. And that will represent a high economic, social, and environmental cost. Thank you, Juan Lucas. Each of these presentations really would give us enough material to have a 1-hour webinar, but thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you for your remark about the national research institutions and how they fit into this whole arrangement. Now we are going to hear about these different parts of the institutional structures, and later on, we will address the questions we have in the chat. So with that, I recognize Julio. Thank you. Thank you very much, Pedro. I see that we have 852 participants. So I greet each and every one of them. I wanted to thank the Inter-American Development Bank, Pedro Martel, Juan Pablo Bonilla. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you for this possibility of sharing with Carolina and Juan Lucas the presentations of this seminar. We have been friends for a long time. The matter of institutions, the institutional framework, is important, but why? 7 years back, a group of those of us who work on rural issues, we set up an independent panel for agricultural development in Latin America and the Caribbean. Why? To look at institutions. And there we had a point of departure, and that is the firm, broad-based agreement among specialists, technical people, political leaders, producers, people working with international organizations. And the whole idea is that the agriculture sector in Latin America has serious shortcomings. And the question that we addressed was, okay, if there is so much agreement regarding the way in which agricultural policy has failed, why is it that those policies are still on the books? Why is it so hard to make a substantial change? Now, the answer to that question has to do with the fact that there are institutional arrangements, there are rules and regulations, often formal, often informal, and because of that, those policies are replicated and maintained despite all of the failures. So the failure is supported by the institutions we have in the region. So the question is, okay, if we want and need policy changes. And that is what Juan Lucas and Carolina were saying. I think we would all agree with that. We have to find a way of moving the institutions forward. In the document that we are presenting, that Carolina and I wrote, we said that institutional changes have to occur in 5 different dimensions. It's not a matter of changing the organizational charts in the ministries of agriculture. That would not be enough. We have to take the steps that are listed here on this slide. And I should have set my stopwatch to keep track of time. I don't want to go over. I should have done that first. Okay. We started by acknowledging that neither the society nor the governments acknowledge how much rural areas contribute to our societies. They do not realize that rural areas can be a driving factor of the transformation of our countries. One of the most important intellectuals produced by our region, in this case, the Caribbean, is Sir Dale Lewis, and that was decades ago. And he said that development is getting away from the rural area. Rural areas lag behind, they're the tradition, they hold us back, they negate progress. So we have to overcome that statement made years and years ago, but that has continued to persist in the minds of our societies and our decision makers. That's why the first dimension is to come to realize how valuable rural areas are. But increasing the value we attach to them is not going to occur by magic. We can't just focus on the weaknesses, saying there's a lot of poverty, there's a lack of infrastructure, et cetera, because by reaffirming the failures, that only reinforces this concept that rural areas are ballast, that they are a weight that we all have to carry. Now, first, we have to look at these 3 factors to increase the importance we attach to rural areas. First of all, understanding how important rural areas are for an environment. And as Carolina was saying, also we need to focus on the need for a healthy diet. Juan Lucas referred to that, saying we have to leave behind that race for calories. We have to leave that behind and focus on a new type of diet. And third, and important, the growing economic and demographic weight of rural urban territories. That's cities with up to 400,000 people that live very closely connected to the rural areas contained within those cities, usually cities of medium size, and consequently, this rural urban territories allow us to think that we can break away from the models of having big cities, Sao Paulo, Bogota, Mexico City. And with these 3 factors, we believe it is possible to increase the value we attach to the rural sector. Now, in basically urban minds, we want them to understand that rural doesn't mean something that's bucolic, but that rural areas have to do with their own lives, with their own well-being, with their own possibilities of development. And that is something that has to be taught beginning in our schools. There's a lot of debate about rural education. It's important, but I would say that perhaps urban education is more important than rural education. We need to teach how important rural areas are. And also we have to look at the social administration. We have to look at the cultural conception of the rural. Then we have to look at the institutional framework. Here, I wanted to mention something that is more political, and then I will turn to more functional elements. The political key in our mind has to do with including consumers in the urban world in the sector institutions, leaving behind a period where the ministries, the institutions represented only the interests, the priorities of producers and the rural environment. If we don't make certain that the sector institutions focus on this connection between urban and rural, it will be hard to change the institutions as we move forward. And functionally, these new organizations have to take on at least these four functions. They have to be able to coordinate, they have to coordinate and assure collaboration more than focusing on execution. Ministries really cannot be in charge of the economic, social, and environmental dimensions on their own. We have to give greater weight to the regulatory, the normative functions, and that has to do with environmental issues, technology, and nutritional aspects. Also, there has to be more strategic and intelligence capacity and greater effectiveness. Now, public expenditure is something closely related to institutional matters. If we do not change the way that we spend our budget, everything else is in vain. And here in public expenditures, we have a couple of problems. The IDB has done something great. It developed something called Agri-Monitor. I suggest that you look it up and you use it. It has been a great contribution. First of all, we have insufficient public spending. And secondly, the relatively little that we do have is misspent. So little money to spend and misspent. Now, Eugenio Diaz Bonilla in the series 2030 that was mentioned by Carolina, and I put the link in the chat, that work shows that what Eugenio called the index of spending, which has to do with how much public spending goes to the sector versus the weight of the sector in the total economy. So there is an index. And what Agri-Monitor shows is that in Latin America, it is 0.38. 1 would be the optimum, where the spending on agriculture would reflect the proportion of the GDP. Now, I'm correcting myself, he says, between 0.31 and 0.37. So for Latin America, the correct numbers were 0.31, 0.37. And in developed countries, the index is 125. So we are very far from spending on this sector what we should be. But in addition to investing little, we invest poorly. Now, these charts on the right side of your screen show you that in 16 countries of the region, direct subsidies going to producers represent 40% of the sector's budget. And that detracts from investing in research, innovation, infrastructure, food security, and a lot of the things that you have been mentioning in the chat, because I've been following the chat. Now, why are these services weak? These public services that are common goods. Why? Because we are spending all the money on providing resources to farmers. Now, who gets that? In Latin America, the spending is regressive. So most of this budget winds up in the pockets of those farmers that need less support.
The fourth item has to do with land development. And those of you who know me know that I could spend hours talking about land development, and that'd be an easy task. But this is because there cannot be an institutional framework that is more effective and can bolster transformation if the same institutional framework doesn't understand that there is a territorial diversity, and I'm not talking about just cultural diversity, geographical diversity, but also in how different areas in the rural sector develop and the differences in that development. And so I'm talking about more isolated rural areas, but also, which is more important today, I'm talking about the rural urban areas, these areas that make up a small or mid-sized city and that bring together urban and rural areas within one same city identity. Now, if we do not allow for the different players in these areas to play a more leading role, then we are not going to have a functioning sector approach. Now, there has been a lot of development over the last 20 years, but it hasn't been done very effectively. We tend to replicate a lot of the former sector agricultural policies from the past. There are 6 points here that I believe we need to overcome in order to truly achieve the potential. The fifth point has to do with governance and governability. This is where policy comes in. This is where politics come in as well. Now, we cannot have a new institutional framework and new policies if there are no changes in power relations. Gustavo Gordillo, in one of the papers that came out during the 2030 series, stated the following: a new kind of governance means a significant transfer of power within central government. Among these, and the state level or provincial powers as well, shared among all of these players, and city governments between state and non-state players, and also within state governments. In other words, the institutional framework we have, it reflects the power relations across all of these dimensions. And so institutional change is always political in nature, not policy driven, but politically driven. There is a development report from the IDB that dates back to 2017, and I think is certainly worth reading it. And one of the questions is, can institutions change in these very complex times, in given climate change, or what we're addressing here at this seminar? And the answer is yes. These changes in power relations can be achieved when looking at three different factors: negotiations among the elite, the engagement of the public, and international influence. And so we need not be pessimistic about this. The growing weight of environmental regulations within agricultural policies has to do with these very factors. Now, I'm going to close here because I know that I've come over my time, but I'll finish with this question on COVID 19. When we published this paper, COVID 19 was not a thing. And COVID obviously has challenged many of our approaches and our ideas. And so the question is it still valid? Do I have an answer? I don't. What will COVID do in the future? What will the impact be? I don't know. But I know that it creates a paradox because institutional change has never been as necessary, and we have never had as many restrictions to achieving it as we do now. Can we come out of this deep well that we're currently in terms of the economic crisis, what we're seeing in the lack of social safety net, the poverty that is all around us, the growing unemployment? Can all of this be addressed without institutional change? Are the institutions and those leading those institutions at this time able to lead us out of this crisis? I don't think so. And yet, the needs right now could not be
Muchas gracias, Julio.
any
Antes
more
de ver la
intense.
primera slide, muy
Thank you,
probablemente
Julio. Thank you very much. Very thought provoking what you had
has marcado la cancha para ir
to
contestando
close with, because that
porque
question is a
no
great thing to
sabemos
think about. You know,
cuál será la
why
solución.
why not? Do we know what solutions
Todavía
to
no,
put
no
forward?
lo internalizamos en la acción, ¿no?
Why have our words not been turned into
En
action
realidad,
yet?
todos los que hemos trabajado en esto, de una u otra forma,
And Those of us who have been involved in this work all see this as a challenge. And I think that that is part of what we see in the end, in the final conclusions of these papers. It's just exactly what role we're all to play. Now, if I can come to something specific here, and this is, I think, a key part of what you try to highlight in the paper. I don't have the answer, but I would love to hear what you think. Perhaps this is a different spin on the question I asked Carolina. So we talk about the rural sector being something that can drive change, and it doesn't need to be seen as what has been left behind, but rather the opportunity for the future. How do we get that message across? What do you think? Well, I don't think that the meaningful changes that we need will take place without institutional change. That's what I already said. But we do need to recognize that the institutions that we have now were not pulled out of a hat. They are there because they were built and because someone continues to defend its presence and support its work. And there is a lot of energy being invested to keep those institutions around. Now, when we talk about changing an institution, sometimes we can look at the specific work that has been done here. For example, what happened with some of the changes in the research department within an institution. And even when you look at something more specific, you see that there are major roadblocks. And so here, I think this is not necessarily just thinking about new political coalitions that can drive some of these changes in institutions. But going further, and this is why I think that what Juan Pablo Bonilla said during his seminar was just right. How do we bring urban players into this dynamic? Those worried about the environment, those living in cities, those who want healthier food. In other words, there are a lot of people living in urban areas whose demands have an impact on what happens in rural areas. And so if we're not addressing this issue alongside these players, then we have an uphill battle before us. Thank you very much. And that is perfectly in line with what we have been discussing so far. Now, just looking at the chat, we have a few questions. It's impossible to get all of these in before we run out of time. But I will highlight that if we look down at the number of participants, we have cracked 1,000. So that is a great deal of people with us today. I'm trying to merge some of these questions we got from the audience. This is a question for Juan Lucas. So this isn't necessarily about technological innovation. I know we talk about some of the international innovation hubs, some of those needs, but here I think that the private sector has an important role to play. And so I'm wondering, what do you think this role is for the private sector? And there's one question that's coming from the audience that talks about how to bring these technologies to the masses within this sector. How do you do that? So once again, Juan Lucas, what do you think the role for the public sector is and the opportunities for promoting mass use of technology? Well, I think what Julio was talking about has to do with a social and political movement that can really drive change in institutions. And that's part of the issue here. But coming back to your question, I do think that the private sector ultimately is going to be the leapfrog agent. That is where we get that quantum leap. Look at Unilever, one of the biggest food companies in the world. And they just decided that in Hemor, that sells some of the chicken bouillon that we eat up and down the Americas, that's Knorr. They have about 50 products that they are going to rethink and produce locally in order to change some of those value chains. And so just like Unilever, there are other major companies that have been talking about that sort of transformation, a transformation of our food systems. And so the private sector here is going to be a change maker. And so they're either going to do it with a positive attitude, like what Unilever is doing, which actually leads to a lot of positive things, or they can do it the other way around, which is following the automation of a lot of these different activities. And I just give you an example of some of these other changes. Burger King had one of its most innovative products with Beyond Burger, and that's a burger that has no meat. And so here, meat has been replaced, and that is something that came from the private sector and is going to really change the landscape and will also change some of the incentives for people who are operating in that space. I know that recently someone was talking about different cell cultures and how in the future that may be able to substitute up to 70% of the current livestock activity taking place. And so these are new trends that are going to continue. And at the same time, we have to look at what is going to happen with lobbying and with regulations and those who are going to want to defend business as usual practices. And so essentially a lot of things happening, a lot of moving pieces, all very complex. But if we take a hard look, the private sector is involved in most of these.
Muchas gracias, Juan Lucas.
Thank
Insisto,
you very much, Juan Lucas.
creo
And
que
again,
del
all of these questions that we are getting through the chat,
discusión y no quiero
I think
otras
could lead to very rich discussions. Now, I'm going to move to another question, and I know that they may not all seem to be connected, but I think they're all connected in some way, particularly when we think about institutions. Now, Carlina, turning to you,
interesante, creo que la abarcan un poco más
there's an interesting question here, and perhaps this is something you more thoroughly discuss in the book, and it has to do with two
alimentarios. ¿Cuál es el
topics. In these agri-food systems,
digamos, o la participación de las mujeres en los procesos productivos, uno,
how involved are women in these production systems? And also, what about indigenous populations? I know that this is all addressed in the book more thoroughly. We don't have that much time. Now, linked to that, and I apologize for packing three questions into one. What about migration? All linked to this. And so, if you don't have opportunities in the rural sector, then perhaps that leads to more migration. And so, what do you think is the future of gender inclusion, women's participation, indigenous peoples as well? And also, how is that linked to migration, and whether you can think of any policies that have to do with either food or health or anything else that has to do with this overarching institutional theme? And I know that it's not easy to answer all that, but up to you.
Perhaps there are a couple of possible answers. First of all, as you were saying, in the rural world, we have an overrepresentation of populations that are of indigenous or African descent. And although this, as Julio was saying, is mentally associated with laggards, also that should be viewed as an opportunity in terms of diversity, ancestral knowledge, conservation practices, but also they should be viewed as allies in terms of relevant policies, not only for agri-food policies, but also for conservation. A lot of the forested areas, a lot of the highly diverse areas, the areas that are so key to produce water resources, are in the hands of Afro-descendants or indigenous populations. And there are interesting forms of conservation, of generating these quote, nature-based solutions, making it possible to promote social inclusion, respecting diversity, and also promoting prosperity and increasing the number of sources of income and assuring environmental sustainability. So yes, there are solutions in the rural world, and we're seeing this in the region. There are some interesting experiences. There's an excellent paper that was published by the CIAT team. You can read Series 2030. There's a document on poverty, presence of indigenous and Afro ancestry, and also this is David Kaipovich, part of the same series. So there is a lot of evidence, and this has to be viewed as a very major asset, and that asset has to be part of the value proposition of the rural area. Now, in the case of women, greater participation of women in the labor market and their participation in the value chain. This is important for prosperity, and also it has to do with social protection and improvement in nutrition and food sources. There is a lot in that series I was describing on that issue. So women have to be viewed as an agent of change and also as the target of many policies. And not only social policies, we have a bias in recent years towards looking only at participation of women as targets of social policy, whereas actually they're much more dynamic in their involvement. But also there is a gap compared to other groups that make up the rural population. Now, we haven't mentioned another group that plays a key role, and that is rural youth. Here I wanted to say something. Rural youth is an important asset. Nonetheless, young people in rural areas tend to leave, not only looking for opportunities to increase their income, job opportunities, but pursuing education too. In the case of Peru, we have seen an exodus of rural population as of the age of 11, between the ages of 11 and 15. And these are children that want to go to a better high school. They want good secondary education. They want to keep open the possibility of pursuing their studies and even reaching higher education. So we have to improve the opportunities for young people in rural areas. For example, they have the possibility of inheriting land, and we have to create for them other job options without them working as unremunerated family laborers, which is their current prospect. So we have to increase our appreciation of environmental assets, and we have to create factors so as to retain this younger human capital. Now, rural people nowadays are better educated than their fathers and grandfathers were, but we have to make certain that their job opportunities also are improved compared to those of their ancestors. A lot of these young people go to nearby cities. Often they come back home, but many of them go to cities and work in precarious jobs that are low productivity, and that too is correlated with involvement in illegal economies, situations of violence that wind up not being good for them nor for the urban environment. So it's a whole set of challenges that we face, and we have to understand this urban-rural continuum to understand the way things flow within that continuum and how we can have an impact by looking at the policy of private sector investment to open up opportunities for these different groups. Now, of course, the rural population is not all the same, and we need special programs designed to target those different groups.
Me había quedado sin micrófono.
I had been muted. I'm sorry. Thank you, Carolina.
Como vemos, es un,
As we can all see,
este tema es, digamos, multi,
this is a multidisciplinary, I guess I should say multidisciplinary, more than multi-sectoral question. But I really like the way that you dealt with this question, Carolina, and I'm glad you spoke of the youth. Now, here we have another question in the chat, and I will ask Julio this question. Carolina now was talking about, and I don't know how to say this, but perhaps if we don't have a decentralized government that can provide those services, increasing the access for these populations that live in rural areas, in terms of decentralization, and we have talked about this before, but what do you think the major challenge is to decentralize government so as to provide these services to meet these needs that exist in the countries, in keeping with each country's own characteristics? I don't know if you could tell us a bit about that, and I think that that ties in with what Carolina was saying towards the end of her remarks when she talked about opportunities. Yes, thank you. Well, decentralization, of course, has major limitations, but it's definitely been a major step forward in the region. And this goes back to the 90s. That's when it started, when there was a major decentralization. We always say it's not enough, that local governments are quite precarious, and that is true. But I do think that the counterfactual of right now, for example, finding ourselves in this crisis without local governments would be, I don't know, but I think it would be disastrous. So definitely local governments, and I especially wanted to say intermediate governments. In some countries, they are departmental, regional, provincial, but that intermediate level of government has to be much, much stronger in terms of policies and institutions dealing with the rural. Now, everyone who works in this area has said this, but this presupposes that along with the transfer of knowledge, we have to also transfer resources and capacities. If we look at the rural municipalities in Latin America, there are 14, 15,000 rural municipalities, and most of them are tiny, very small, and there the local government can hardly even begin to think about the challenges of climate change, technological changes. So that would be miles and miles away from their capabilities. So that is why I wanted to talk about the role for these intermediate government institutions. They have greater political weight, they have more resources than what local governments have. Now, we do have a huge problem, and that has to do with policy quality at the level of intermediate levels of government. We have a policy problem in the region, generally speaking, but I think that it's especially something that applies to local government. So once again, there is an imbalance between what we need. We need intermediate and local governments playing a much greater role in the process of policy development for the rural sector, and the distance between them and their capabilities. Now, of course, we also talked about land development, and you cannot even think about that without those levels of government. So it's because of the weakness of those governments that land use development has not paid off as we thought. when we began to contemplate this possibility. I think that one of the major transfers, and a lot of transfers have to be made to support these intermediate and local governments. I always forget to turn on my mic. I apologize. Thank you, Julio. We only have 4 minutes left, but I wanted to recognize each of you for 30 seconds. So perhaps you could use those 30 seconds if there's something that you intended to say. Our audience is still connected, and I apologize to everyone who contributed with questions over the chat, but we will definitely share this information with our colleagues. A lot of the comments have been very interesting, so thank you very much. And so Carolina, Juan Lucas, Julio, 30 seconds each. A final thought, something that you left out, something you would like to convey to our audience, and then I will do the final wrap-up. Thank you, Pedro. What I would say as a final thought, actually 2 final thoughts. First, yes, without rural development, there's no possibility of developing the region. So we necessarily have to tackle this challenge of getting rural transformation. And we have to do inclusion, prosperity, and sustainability simultaneously. That is the challenge, and it's unavoidable. The question is, do we want to do this well thought through by force, or do we want to try to move ahead along each of these different work streams? And then second, COVID, the pandemic, opens up a lot of challenges and limitations, but at the same time, it has really showcased the importance of the rural areas for our whole region. If we don't seize this opportunity, where the IMF this week issued a blog saying we have to support our food chains, we need policies to make our agriculture resilient, inclusive. When are we going to be able to do this? Right now is the time to address this issue and to increase our appreciation of rural areas to promote the institutional changes we need to promote a rural transformation. And thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you today. Juan Lucas, well, also, I wanted to thank you. I'm very happy to have been able to join you. Pedro, as you said, each of our topics could lend itself to a full-scale webinar. There are a couple of things that I think we left out, things that we need to look at, see when we can tackle them. One is looking at this whole food and agricultural development perspective, is looking at knowledge, innovation, agricultural extension, connection to use. All of those factors are essential. And there is a tremendous space for this. It's not only a matter of information technology, it's something that also deals with institutions, decentralization, et cetera. So I would call on the bank to address those issues and see how we can all work in the same direction. And then second, we know that we need a more diverse plate on our table. We need to have more nuts, more fruits, more vegetables, but that is something that poor people cannot afford. Poor in rural or urban areas, it's hard. They're always at the end of the line. So we have to look at nutritional diversity through the lens of poverty. And that question will give us an answer that will lay out avenues for change, doing things that are feasible, because otherwise advanced societies change their consumption habits, but our poor people, the people living on the margin, are the ones that are left behind. And of course, they are the most affected by COVID today and for any other COVID in the future. So once again, thank you. Thank you, Juan Lucas. Julio? Thank you. First of all, I wanted to express my appreciation. It's quite impressive to see that 1,000 people connected to this program. It's wonderful. And it's great that someone discovered how to hold these meetings, but it would be even better if it were more interactive. It would be great to hear 1,000 voices. So I take advantage of this opportunity to call on the IDB to take a very major role in this area we have been discussing. 30 seconds ago, I received a report from ECLAC, and it talks about 9.2% drop in the GDP of our region. I don't know when the last time was that we witnessed a drop of 9.2. I don't know if this has ever occurred before. So this is a hole that we can't even imagine. They are projecting 28 million new people in extreme poverty, 28 million. And that represents a 40% in extreme poverty, dire poverty. And it happened in a matter of months. So 40% increase of people falling into extreme poverty. So 1 out of every 3 people in Latin America and the Caribbean will be living in a situation of extreme poverty. 1 out of 3. So the countries are going to be overwhelmed. Governments, citizens, everyone is going to be overwhelmed by this terrible tsunami that is drowning us. And it's up to the banks, institutions like the IDB, to play a very important role. You are investing, supporting the countries, helping them pull through this tragedy, and giving them tools for transformation. And that is essential. This tremendous blow can wind up by producing 2 things in the future years. It can produce a Latin America pushed back by who knows how many years, how many decades, or a very battered Latin America, but at least with important embryos of transformation. I think that many colleagues at the IDB has the resources that governments need to invest in this situation. So it's important that you guide, that you channel that investment. We and the FAO are at your disposal to participate in this process, but this does require a historic effort. Thank you, Julio. Thank you for commenting on the historic effort. I think that we're all very mindful of what is needed, Julio. And I think that this is what Carolina was calling for, seizing this opportunity. And it's not easy. Sometimes you say these things, they sound easier when you're sitting behind your desk, but doing is the challenge we face. And that's why we're here as an institution. That is our job. Our institution, or institutions in general. Carolina, for example, Juan Lucas represent other institutions, or sectoral approaches like FAO. We're part of this community, and precisely with this view in mind, better understanding what the opportunities are and finding space to continue to support the region to reach this virtuous transformation and seize this opportunity. So with that, I thank all of you. I thank all the participants. And what Julio just said, yes, we have to find a way to hear the 1,000 voices. We'll find a way. But thank you once again. I thank everyone who took part in organizing this event, people working for the bank. And I thank the audience, and especially our panelists. Thank you very much.
Is there anything to add? I just wanted to thank everyone. We're going to share these videos in our blog at the IDB on coronavirus issues. And so thank you all very much. We have a great deal of information on the coronavirus on our blog and on our website, and so these videos will also be available there. Thank you all for being with us for an hour and a half. This was a great event. All of our panelists stuck to the time that we asked them to stick to, and so it all went great, all on time. Thank you all very much. We look forward to seeing you at the next edition, and like they said, perhaps it'll be more interactive, something we're working on. Thank you all very much. Great. For 1,000 attendees, fantastic. Thank you.
Bye.